Hey, how you doing? This is Adam Post. Trump blocks government in hostile takeover to protect transition team. Donald Trump has been through this once before. The last time that he put his cabinet together and they transitioned into controlling the federal government, a lot of information that was not supposed to be made public was made public. There were a lot of leaks. And from America First Legal, they uncovered violation after violation of nominee information that was also used to embarrass nominees, to delay nominees being accepted. None of that's going to happen this time around. Coming from the Washington Post, Trump ignores transition rules. It's a hostile takeover, according to an ally. Hostile takeover is a business kind of corporate reference. It's when you take over a company without the permission of the other company. Here's a good explanation. A hostile takeover is a type of acquisition where one company, the acquirer, takes control of another company, the target company, without the target company's board of directors approving of the deal. The Trump team is not looking for approval, acceptance, review by, or leaking from the Biden administration's federal team. They're skipping them altogether. They're doing this transition out of their own offices with their own equipment, their own resources, and even providing private funding for Trump's cabinet and his key people out of Florida. Trump's transition team is not submitting cabinet picks, key people, or anyone else for any kind of security clearances or FBI background checks. They're doing some private checks. Once Trump takes over the government, then they'll do FBI checks because then Trump will control the FBI. From The Guardian, Trump officials to receive immediate clearances and easier FBI vetting. President-elect's team planning for background checks to occur only after administration takes over the Bureau. Now, that doesn't mean on January 20th, 2025, that there's going to be a nominee that's approved by the cabinet to be the head of the FBI. Are they going to use a recess appointment? We don't know. Are they going to use an acting head of the FBI? That would be my guess. There's been no talk about it. We'll have to see how things go over the next couple of months. But they're not going to allow the FBI that investigated Trump or the DOJ that arrested his former advisors, putting Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon in jail. He's not going to allow those people to get mixed up with his new transition, and he doesn't have to. Coming from the conservative treehouse, Trump transition team signs modified White House agreement without government technology to conduct surveillance. The President Trump transition team has signed a memorandum of understanding to start the process of transferring control of the federal government. And a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, is just a simple agreement. The landing teams from each of the cabinets will now begin to engage with their exiting counterparts. The landing teams are just the key people to coordinate what it is that they're doing at one department so that the new people can understand that and move forward. There were many articles written about the delays in signing the agreements. However, President Trump waited until he had his cabinet fully assembled before signing the first part that permits the landing teams to engage. The second part, with the government-provided offices and technology, will not be accepted. President Trump's chief of staff, Susie Wiles, announced the Trump transition team has refused to sign an MOU with the Government Services Administration and will not be using cell phones, computers, offices, or any technology provided by the GSA. This is a good move for Trump because it avoids the deep state surveillance situation that was faced in the first term. In the first Trump administration, the GSA had wiretaps, office bugs, and gave all the electronic communication information from the Trump transition to the FBI, intelligence community, and later Robert Mueller. In essence, the GSA spied on the Trump team and then gave the data to the operatives who were in place to target those people. The transition team is also not going to use the office space provided by the GSA and will instead have their own offices and security systems in place to coordinate the transition to power. Politico and the rest of the people in the government are still not happy about this because it gives Trump freedom and it prevents them from attacking Trump's transition team. The Trump team's unprecedented delay in signing these agreements weeks after being declared the winner of the election had alarmed former officials and ethics experts who warned it could lead to conflicts of interest and leave the new government unprepared on day one. In the Tuesday announcement, Wiles suggested the Trump transition will not sign a separate agreement with the General Services Administration, which would have allowed them to receive federal funding, cybersecurity support, and government office space, pledging instead to fund the transition with private dollars, run it out of private facilities, and deploy their own existing security and information protections for sensitive data. The transition, Wiles said, Wiles is Donald Trump's incoming chief of staff, said this, quote, will operate as a self-sufficient organization, adding that declining government funding will save taxpayers hard-earned money. And while Wiles also pledged in the Tuesday statement to publicly disclose the private donors to the transition and not accept foreign donations, there will be no legal mechanism to enforce those promises of transparency. The lack of federal cybersecurity support could also make the Trump transition a softer target for foreign hackers, who already successfully penetrated the campaign earlier this year. Quote, that's something that in 2020 was maybe the single most important worry of the Biden transition team, that they would be hacked, and that all of this information, including intelligence information, personal information about job applicants, would be threatened. It's imperative that the Trump transition team has installed the proper procedures to protect itself. The Trump transition team is not going to allow all of that personal information, all of those vectors of attack, all of those opportunities that their investigators could then go and search up on each of these people, and then before we know it, we see leak after leak after leak just to damage Trump's people. He's not having any of that. White House spokesperson Saloni Sharma said the Biden administration is concerned about the ramifications of their successors foregoing GSA support, but remains committed to an orderly transition. She said this, quote, while we do not agree with the Trump transition team's decision to forego signing the GSA MOU, we will follow the purpose of the Presidential Transition Act, which clearly states that any disruption occasioned by the transfer of the executive power could produce results detrimental to the safety and well-being of the United States and its people. In the White House memo, Sharma also added, the Trump transition agreed to important safeguards to protect non-public information and prevent conflicts of interest, including who has access to the information and how the information is shared, and also agreed to publicly share the ethics agreements it's imposing on its own employees. It is a hostile takeover. Donald Trump's transition team has begun what a close ally calls a hostile takeover of the federal government, ignoring the rules for the handover of power in the process. 1,000 miles from the austere buildings where Washington runs, Donald Trump's transition team in his Mar-a-Lago resort has begun what a close ally calls a hostile takeover of the federal government. Since his victory, Trump has ignored many of the rules and practices intended to guide a seamless transfer of power and handover of the oversight of 2.2 million federal employees. Instead, the president-elect, who has pledged to fire thousands of civil servants and slash billions of dollars in spending, has so far almost fully cut out the government agencies his predecessors have relied on to take charge of the federal government. Trump has yet to collaborate with the General Services Administration, which he is not going to ever do, who is tasked with the complex work of handing over control of hundreds of agencies, because he has not turned over and required pledges to follow ethics rules. His transition teams have yet to set foot inside a single federal office. Now, those landing teams will be setting foot inside those offices because they just signed the agreement the other day. And also, really importantly, he's not coordinating with the State Department. In calls with foreign heads of state, Trump has cut out the State Department, its secure lines, and its official interpreters. They don't have transcriptions of Trump's calls. They can't accuse Trump or any of his people of saying this or doing that like they did with Michael Flynn. It's going to be a lot more difficult to use Trump's own FBI or DOJ to tie him up or his high-level people up in some kind of a nonsense scandal or series of scandals in this administration. As Trump's team considers hundreds of potential appointees for key jobs, he's so far declined to let the Federal Bureau of Investigation check for potential red flags and security threats to guard against espionage, instead relying on private campaign lawyers for some appointees and doing no vetting for all others. Trump's transition team is considering moving on his first day in office to give those appointees blanket security clearances according to people familiar with the discussions who spoke on the condition of anonymity to disclose private conversations, which Trump has the authority to do. He's the head of the executive branch. He can give a blanket, complete security clearance to anybody he wants to, with research, without research. It's completely up to Trump. At the root of this unprecedented approach, say those close to Trump's administration, is an abiding distrust and resentment of federal agencies that the president-elect blames for blocking his agenda, which they did, leaking his plans to the press, which they did, and later sharing his documents with investigators and bringing criminal charges against him, which they did. And some of those documents were what you would call privileged documents, documents produced by attorneys doing attorneys' work. And from a letter to congressional committees looking into this inappropriate release of privileged material by the government, it said this: "We discovered the unauthorized disclosures by the GSA on December 12th and 13th, 2017. When we learned that the special counsel's office had received certain laptops and cell phones containing privileged materials, we initially raised our concerns with Brandon Van Grack in the special counsel's office on December 12, 2017. Mr. Van Grack confirmed that the special counsel's office had obtained certain laptops, cell phones, and at least one iPad from the GSA, but assured us that the special counsel's investigation did not recover any emails or other relevant data from that hardware." During this exchange, Van Grack forgot something kind of important. His office, the special counsel's office, had simultaneously received from the GSA tens of thousands of emails, including a very significant volume of privileged material, and that the special counsel's office was actively using those materials without any notice to TFA. Simply put, the GSA took information that they should not have released and gave it to Robert Mueller so those people could take additional months, additional time, additional money, leaking things and going through things they had no right to look at. For Trump, who campaigned on radically reshaping the federal government by moving entire departments out of Washington, closing others, and replacing scores of civil servants with political loyalists, fulfillment of that vision begins with a privately run transition from Palm Beach and nearby offices. Quote, "The American people rendered their verdict by putting him back in the White House," said Mike Davis, president of the Article 3 Project, a nonprofit group that's defended Trump against the criminal charges brought against him. Quote, "He should not trust the politicized and weaponized intelligence and law enforcement agencies that hobbled his presidency the first time. It's a hostile takeover on behalf of the American people." In choosing his cabinet, Trump has emphasized a willingness to take on federal agencies he believed have wronged him or stymied him in the past, advisors said. Many of the president-elect's moves to skirt official transition policies are within the law, according to experts. But his transition alarms some officials who say the president-elect is weakening transparency, eroding checks and balances, and risking national security. Quote, "The Trump team is attempting to convert the government into an instrument of his private agenda," according to Max Stier, president and chief executive officer of the nonpartisan nonprofit Partnership for Public Service. Instead, Stier said, "We're seeing a push to revert to the spoils system, a reference to the 19th century practice of rewarding supporters with government jobs without vetting them and often not based on merit." I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what about someone who used to be a former ambassador to Bulgaria? What do they think about this? Eric Rubin, a former ambassador to Bulgaria who led the American Foreign Service Association before his retirement last year, called the approach a, quote, "massive crossing of unwritten lines that have prevailed in presidential transitions for 140 years. He acknowledged that Trump is able to take advantage of the reality that so much of our system is not written. Presidential transitions are formally led by the GSA, which typically provides furnished office space for computer support to both nominees and for pre-election planning. But Trump harbors deep distrust for the agency, several allies said, which shared thousands of emails from his 2016 transition team with special counsel Robert Mueller during his probe into allegations of Russian election interference. Trump claimed the correspondence was unlawfully collected and belonged to the transition team, which it was unlawfully collected and it did belong to the transition team. It's also unclear if Trump plans to require his nominees to submit to separate ethics reviews required by the Office of Government Ethics. If not, once his appointees are in the job, the office will be unable to ensure they divest from companies or other entities to avoid potential conflicts. Quote, their conflicts of interest will leave them vulnerable to outside influences, potentially including foreign powers, according to Walter Schaub, who led the office from 2013 to 2017. The day after Trump won the election, congratulatory calls began pouring in from world leaders all over the world. However, Trump did not include State Department officials or U.S. government interpreters on the line, according to government and transition officials. Trump's mistrust of the State Department dates to early in his first presidency, when transcripts of his calls with the President of Mexico and the Australian Prime Minister were leaked in full to the press. Several career diplomats were subpoenaed by Congress to testify at Trump's first impeachment hearings about their alarm at the Trump administration's unorthodox policy towards Ukraine. Trump is not required by law to engage the State Department on calls with foreign leaders. Government officials also traditionally rely on state to help create an official record of such conversations in case disputes arise over what was said. Trump's calls have raised alarms from some foreign policy experts, particularly his call with Vladimir Putin. He advised the Russian president not to escalate the war in Ukraine and reminded him of Washington's sizable military presence in Europe, as the Washington Post reported. The absence of an official transcript of the exchange already has created a challenge for Trump, said Daniel Fried, a retired diplomat now at the Atlantic Council think tank, because the Kremlin quickly denied that the call had taken place. Quote, it would be a lot easier for the Trump team if he were able to say that the Russian team was lying, according to Fried, who played key roles in designing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. Quote, so there's a lot of cost to doing it this way. People are scratching their heads and saying somebody's lying. Yeah, those people are not the decision makers. The president is the decision maker. And if these people are going to leak his conversations, I don't think he's going to let them be on the phone. Trump's transition team has also dispensed with the FBI's role in place since before World War II in performing background checks that form the backbone of security clearances for political appointees. By law, these checks must be performed by federal employees, not private contractors with no agency oversight, to ensure that key decisions affecting public trust are made by, quote, accountable government officials according to federal statute. And yes, Trump, as a government official, will give these people full clearances without this FBI. When he's in charge of the FBI, they will do legitimate background checks. And there will be no leaks. The Senate could also demand an FBI background check before considering a nominee who requires confirmation. The GOP has won back control of the Senate, however, and it's unclear how strongly the majority will push back on Trump's choices. And we also don't know how Trump plans to use recess appointments, and we don't know how Trump plans to use acting directors of things, such as the acting director of FBI, Matthew Whitaker, that Trump put in place during his first term. Trump could, if he wants to, fire the FBI director, put in Kash Patel in an acting role until Kash Patel, for example, would be approved by the Senate. Or Trump could bring back Matt Gaetz, fire Merrick Garland, and put in Matt Gaetz in an acting role as head of the Department of Justice, while Pam Bondi is approved by the Senate. And he could also tell them, look, you could approve Pam Bondi or you can play games and delay her if you want to, but Matt Gaetz will be the acting director of the Department of Justice while you guys are figuring that out, because Trump can put in acting people at the head of any of these agencies that can serve for 6 months at his complete and total discretion, without clearances, without investigations, just on the say-so of the President of the United States. Wouldn't that be an interesting surprise? This is a hostile takeover of the federal government. The federal government employees do not want Donald Trump in charge of the federal government, but they can't help it this time. He's also not giving them a lot of options to investigate and damage his transition team because he doesn't trust them. And could you imagine? I almost forgot that one. The president of Mexico, the Australian prime minister, he's having a private conversation with them and they're leaking it. The government people are leaking that private conversation. They did a lot more than that, and they did a lot worse. But just because they want to get some damaging news cycle going, no, Trump is not going to put them in a position where they can dominate his new government. He will dominate their old government and control the federal government the way he was elected to do on behalf of the American people. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments below. Always love to see your ideas. Please be sure you are subscribed to the channel. Click the bell for notifications. Give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you again soon with another story. And if I don't see you, I will miss you.